The old farmhouse stood like a lighthouse in the growing darkness, its windows glowing warm against the darkening Montana sky. Dorothy Jenkins moved slowly around her kitchen, her hands working from memory as she prepared her evening tea. At 72, her movements had slowed, but the strength in her hands that had raised 4 children, tended countless gardens, and kept this farm running for 50 years, remained steady. Outside, the wind howled, announcing the arrival of what the weatherman had called the storm of the century. Dorothy wasn't worried. She'd seen plenty of Montana winters come and go since she and her late husband Thomas had moved here from Chicago back in 1969. They'd been one of the first black families in the county, and while those early years hadn't always been easy, this place was home now. She glanced at the kitchen window, watching as the first heavy snowflakes began to fall. They came down thick and fast, already beginning to coat the ground in white. This one was going to be bad, she thought. Worse than they were saying on TV. She could feel it in her bones, the same way she could always feel rain coming in her left knee. Dorothy finished her tea preparations and shuffled to the living room, easing herself into Thomas's old recliner. 10 years he'd been gone now, taken by a heart attack while fixing the barn roof. Some days it felt like yesterday. Other days it felt like a lifetime ago. The television flickered with a weather alert. The announcer's voice was serious, warning people to stay indoors. Roads closing across the state. Emergency services stretched thin. Dorothy nodded to herself. She'd already brought extra firewood inside earlier that day, filled the bathtub with water in case the pipes froze, and made sure her emergency radio had fresh batteries. Nobody's going anywhere tonight, she murmured to herself, taking a sip of her tea. 3 hours later, the storm had transformed from bad to something biblical. The wind screamed around the eaves of the house, driving snow horizontal against the windows. The electricity had flickered twice, but thankfully held. Dorothy had just finished checking that all her storm shutters were secure when she heard it, a sound that didn't belong. Through the howling wind came the distinct rumble of motorcycles. Dorothy frowned. Nobody in their right mind would be on a motorcycle in this weather. She peered out the front window but could see nothing beyond the porch in the whiteout conditions. Then she spotted it. Distant headlights on the county road that ran past her property, weaving dangerously. "Lord have mercy," she whispered, reaching for her coat without hesitation. Anyone out in this was in serious trouble. Her closest neighbor was 5 miles away, and the emergency services had already announced they couldn't respond until the storm let up. Whoever was out there was on their own, unless she helped. Dorothy bundled up in layers, thermal underwear, wool sweater, her heaviest coat, snow pants, and the insulated boots Thomas had given her their last Christmas together. She pulled on a hat, wrapped a scarf around her face, and grabbed the heavy-duty flashlight from the mudroom. As she stepped outside, the wind nearly knocked her flat. The snow was already up to her knees in some places, and visibility was no more than 10 feet. Dorothy tucked her chin against her chest and began trudging toward where she'd seen the lights, using the fence line as a guide. "Hello," she called out, her voice immediately swallowed by the wind. "Anyone there?" She kept walking, the flashlight beam bouncing off walls of swirling white. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 15 minutes, she heard voices, men shouting to be heard over the storm. She altered her course, moving toward the sound. The beam of her flashlight finally caught something, reflective patches on a leather jacket. As she got closer, Dorothy saw a group of men huddled together, some trying to keep their motorcycles upright in the growing snowdrifts, others already abandoning them. "Hey!" she shouted as loud as her lungs would allow. "Over here." 9 faces turned toward her, illuminated briefly in her flashlight beam. Even half covered in snow, there was no mistaking what she was seeing. The infamous Death's Head insignia of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club. In her younger years, Dorothy might have hesitated. The Hells Angels had a fearsome reputation. But at 72, having buried a husband and a son, having faced down everything from bank loan officers who didn't want to lend to a black couple, to neighbors who took years to warm up to them, Dorothy Jenkins wasn't easily frightened anymore. "My farm's about a quarter mile that way," she shouted, pointing back the way she'd come. "You boys need to get inside before you freeze to death." One of the men stumbled toward her. He was a mountain of a man, his beard encrusted with ice, his leather jacket offering little protection against the deadly cold. "Ma'am," he said, his voice raspy with cold. We got guys hurt. Bike went down on the ice, Dorothy nodded, immediately taking charge. Anyone who can walk, follow my tracks. For those who can't, we've got my husband's old hunting sled in the shed just over there. She led them to the small equipment shed where Thomas had stored his hunting gear. Inside, protected from the elements, was the large sled he'd used to transport deer back to the house after a successful hunt. Dorothy hadn't had the heart to get rid of it after he passed. Two of the men were in bad shape, one with what looked like a broken arm, the other barely conscious from the cold. Another was limping badly, his leg clearly injured. The remaining 6 worked together to secure their injured friends on the sled. Stay right behind me, Dorothy instructed. Hold on to each other if you have to. We're going to follow the fence line back to the house. The journey back was grueling. The snow was falling faster now, already beginning to fill in the tracks Dorothy had made on her way out. The wind cut through their clothing like knives, and the cold seemed to steal the breath from their lungs. Several times they had to stop while the men took turns pulling the heavy sled through deepening snow. Dorothy kept them moving, her small flashlight the only thing guiding them through the white darkness. She felt the cold settling into her own bones, her fingers and toes beginning to go numb despite her layers, but she pressed on one step after another, knowing that stopping meant death in these conditions. After what seemed like forever, the warm glow of her farmhouse windows appeared through the snow like a miracle. There it is, she called back to the men. Not much farther now. The group stumbled the final distance to her porch, the men hauling their injured companions up the steps. Dorothy fumbled with her keys, her fingers stiff with cold, and finally pushed open the door to her home. Heat enveloped them as they crowded into her entryway, bringing with them swirls of snow and the smell of leather, gasoline and sweat. In the light, Dorothy could finally see them clearly. 9 Hell's Angels, their patches and tattoos marking them as members of one of the most notorious motorcycle clubs in the country. Dorothy didn't waste time, wondering what they were doing in Montana in December or why. They'd been foolish enough to ride into a blizzard. That could come later. Right now, these were just people who needed help. Boots off by the door, she instructed, already pulling off her own snow-covered gear. Those with injuries into the living room. The rest of you, help me get some hot drinks going. We need to warm everybody up before frostbite sets in. The men looked at each other, then at this small, elderly black woman giving them orders like she was their commanding officer. There was a moment of silence, broken when the largest of them, clearly some kind of leader, began unlacing his boots. You heard the lady, he said to the others. Do as she says. As Dorothy hung up her coat, she caught his eye. There was a mix of confusion, respect, and gratitude in his gaze that told her everything she needed to know. These might be tough men with hard reputations, but tonight they were just people who needed shelter from the storm, and Dorothy Jenkins had never once in her life turned away someone who needed help. Dorothy's farmhouse had never been so full of people. The 9 bikers filled her modest living room, their massive frames making her furniture look small and delicate. Outside, the blizzard continued to rage, snow piling against the windows, wind finding every crack and crevice in the old farmhouse walls. Let me see that arm, Dorothy said, kneeling beside a younger biker with shaggy brown hair. He couldn't have been older than 30, and his face was pale with pain. His right arm hung at an awkward angle, clearly broken. It's fine, ma'am, he said through gritted teeth. Dorothy gave him a look that had silenced her own children decades ago. Young man, I raised 4 children on this farm. I've set more broken bones than I can count. Now let me see that arm. The big man who seemed to be the leader nodded at the injured biker. Let her help you, rookie. Carefully, Dorothy examined the arm. It's a clean break, she said after a moment. We need to set it and make a splint. In this weather, it'll be days before any ambulance can get out here. You know how to set bones? Another biker asked, his eyebrows raised. When you live 40 miles from the nearest hospital, you learn to handle things yourself, Dorothy replied, already moving to gather supplies. I'll need some help. Who's got steady hands? A tall, lean man with a salt and pepper beard stepped forward. I was a medic in the Army. Name's Doc. Dorothy nodded, not commenting on the irony of his nickname. Good. I need wooden slats from the kitchen, the cutting boards will work, and clean cloth for bandages. The first aid kit is under the bathroom sink. As Doc went to gather supplies, Dorothy turned to the others. 2 of you need to get out of those wet clothes before hypothermia sets in. There's hot water for showers, and I've got some of my late husband's clothes that might fit. They're in the cedar chest in the spare bedroom. The bikers exchanged glances, clearly unused to being mothered. The leader stepped forward again. "Ma'am, we're grateful, but we don't want to impose one." "It's Dorothy," she interrupted. "And you're not imposing if I'm offering. Now, what's your name?" "They call me Hammer," he said. "Well, Hammer, if you and your friends want to survive this storm, you'll do as I say. I've lived through 60 Montana winters and I know what I'm talking about." Hammer's weathered face broke into a surprised smile. "Yes, ma'am, I mean Dorothy." Over the next hour, Dorothy's farmhouse transformed into a makeshift field hospital. She and Doc set Rookie's broken arm, using wooden cutting boards as splints and torn sheets as bandages. Another biker, who introduced himself as Bear, had severe frostbite on his toes. Dorothy soaked his feet in lukewarm water, gradually increasing the temperature to bring feeling back without causing tissue damage. The third injured man had a concussion from when his bike slid out on the ice. Dorothy checked his pupils, asked him simple questions, and instructed another biker to wake him every 2 hours through the night. Once the immediate medical needs were addressed, Dorothy turned her attention to feeding her unexpected guests. She stoked the fire in the wood stove and began pulling ingredients from her pantry. "Hope you boys aren't picky eaters," she called over her shoulder as she worked. "Storm like this, we make do with what we've got. After freezing half to death out there, anything hot will taste like heaven," said a biker with a thick Boston accent who called himself Tink. As Dorothy prepared a massive pot of stew, the bikers gradually relaxed. They shed their wet outer layers, accepted borrowed clothes, and gathered around the fire. The hot showers and dry clothes had brought color back to their faces, and the smell of cooking food lifted their spirits. "So what brings the Hells Angels to my part of Montana in December?" Dorothy asked as she chopped vegetables. "Most folks around here have enough sense to put their bikes away once the snow starts." The bikers exchanged looks, and Hammer cleared his throat. "We were heading to Billings for a brother's funeral," he explained. "Weather report said the storm wouldn't hit until tomorrow. By the time we realized how bad it was getting, we were too far from the last town to turn back." Dorothy nodded, absorbing this information as she added ingredients to her pot. "I'm sorry about your friend. Cancer," Hammer said simply. He fought it hard, but in the end, he trailed off, the loss clearly still fresh. Dorothy's hands stilled for a moment. "My youngest boy, James, we lost him to cancer 2 years ago. Just turned 40. The kitchen fell silent. Then Hammer spoke again, his voice softer. "I'm sorry for your loss, Dorothy." She nodded, resuming her cooking. "Life goes on for those left behind. That's all we can do." As the stew simmered, filling the house with savory aromas, Dorothy brought out homemade bread from the freezer and set it to warm by the fire. The bikers watched her work with growing appreciation. "You do this kind of thing often?" asked a biker with a long gray ponytail who introduced himself as Preacher. "Rescue stranded travelers in blizzards?" Dorothy laughed. "First time rescuing bikers. Usually it's lost hunters or tourists who don't respect mountain weather." "Well, we owe you our lives," Preacher said seriously. "Not everyone would have come out in that storm, especially not for a bunch of Hells Angels?" Dorothy finished when he trailed off. "Young man, I've lived long enough to know you can't judge a book by its cover. My Thomas taught me that. When we moved here in '69, plenty of folks took one look at our skin color and decided they knew everything about us." She stirred the stew thoughtfully. "Thomas always said I'd treat folks like they're your family until they give you reason not to. So that's what I do." The stew was ready just as night fell completely. Dorothy ladled generous portions into bowls and passed them around, along with thick slices of bread. The bikers ate ravenously, some going back for seconds and thirds. "This might be the best thing I've ever eaten," Bear declared, sopping up gravy with a piece of bread. Dorothy waved away the compliment, but her eyes crinkled with pleasure. You'd think anything was good after being half frozen. After dinner, Hammer insisted that his men clean up. Dorothy directed them around her kitchen, showing them where things belonged and supervising their work with a sharp eye. "You boys aren't as hopeless as you look," she commented when they'd finished. "Ma'am, Dorothy, some of us have been taking care of ourselves for a long time," Doc said with a smile. As the evening wore on, the wind outside intensified. Dorothy checked the weather report on her battery-powered radio. The news wasn't good. The storm was expected to last at least another 2 days, with 3 feet of snow predicted. "Looks like we're stuck with each other for a while," she announced to the room. Roads won't be clear for days. The bikers nodded, accepting this news with surprising calm. We've slept in worse places than a warm living room, Hammer said. And in worse company. Dorothy began gathering blankets and pillows from around the house. Injured men take the bedrooms, she decided. The rest of you can spread out down here. Anybody snores too loud, they get sent to the porch. This prompted laughter, breaking the last of the tension. As Dorothy distributed bedding, she noticed Tink examining the framed photos on her mantel. That your family? He asked, pointing to a picture of Dorothy with 4 adults and several children. My children and grandchildren, she confirmed. They wanted me to move to Bozeman after Thomas passed, but she gestured around the farmhouse. This is home. They visit much? Preacher asked, when they can. My oldest, Lillian, she tries to come out once a month. The others are scattered, California, Texas, Georgia. Hard to get back often. Must get lonely out here, Bear observed. Dorothy shrugged. I've got my garden in summer, my quilting in winter. Church ladies come by for tea sometimes. I keep busy. But there was something in her voice that made the bikers exchange glances. The farmhouse might be well maintained, but it was a lot for one elderly woman to manage alone. As everyone settled in for the night, Dorothy checked on the injured men one last time. Rookie's arm was properly splinted. Bear's feet were warming up nicely and the concussed biker was stable. Satisfied with her nursing, she retired to her own bedroom. Before closing her door, she paused in the hallway, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of people in her home. Quiet conversation, occasional laughter, the creak of floorboards as someone moved from one spot to another. It had been a long time since her house had felt so full of life. Dorothy smiled to herself as she prepared for bed. Thomas would have gotten a kick out of this. Their home filled with Hell's Angels of all people. She could almost hear his deep chuckle. Well, Thomas, she whispered to the empty room. Life sure does take some unexpected turns. Outside, the blizzard continued its assault. But inside Dorothy's farmhouse, warmth and safety reigned. 9 tough bikers and 1 elderly woman, thrown together by circumstance, found themselves forming an unlikely community as the snow piled higher around them. Dorothy woke before dawn, as she had every day for the past 50 years. For a moment, she lay still in her bed, listening. The house felt different somehow, fuller, warmer. Then she remembered her guests. 9 Hell's Angels stranded by the blizzard. She pulled on her robe and slippers and quietly opened her bedroom door. The house was still dark, the only light coming from the dying embers in the fireplace. In the dim glow, she could make out large shapes sprawled across her living room floor, some snoring softly. Dorothy moved carefully to the kitchen and began her morning routine. She stoked the fire in the wood stove, put coffee on to brew, and peered out the window. What she saw made her sigh. Snow had drifted nearly to the windowsills, and it was still coming down hard. They weren't going anywhere today. As the coffee perked, filling the kitchen with its rich aroma, a large figure appeared in the doorway. Morning, Hammer said softly, his voice a low rumble. Hope I'm not disturbing you. Dorothy shook her head. I'm up with the chickens every day. Coffee? Please. She poured him a mug, and they stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching the snow through the window. Your boys still sleeping? Dorothy asked. Hammer nodded. Most of them. Doc's checking on Rookie and the others. I should take a look at them too, Dorothy said, after breakfast. You've done enough already, Hammer began, but Dorothy waved him off. It's no trouble. Now how do you feel about helping me make breakfast for this crowd? I'm thinking biscuits and gravy. Maybe some eggs if we can get to the henhouse. Hammer looked momentarily surprised at being assigned kitchen duty, then nodded. Yes, ma'am, though I should warn you my cooking skills are limited. You can stir, Dorothy decided, handing him a wooden spoon. And I told you yesterday it's Dorothy. By the time the others began to stir, the kitchen was filled with the smell of baking biscuits and sizzling sausage gravy. Dorothy had Hammer set the large dining table that rarely saw use these days, while she checked on her injured guests. Rookie's arm was causing him considerable pain, but the splint was holding well. The biker with the concussion, who Dorothy now knew was called Wheels, seemed much improved, his eyes clearer and his headache lessened. Bear's frostbitten toes were pink rather than white, a good sign. You should have been a nurse, Doc commented as he watched Dorothy change Bear's bandages. Dorothy smiled. Wanted to be once upon a time. Life had other plans. By mid-morning, all 9 bikers were awake and seated around Dorothy's dining table, demolishing platters of biscuits and gravy. Dorothy watched with satisfaction as they ate. There was something deeply fulfilling about feeding people, about seeing hunger satisfied. "This storm doesn't look like it's letting up anytime soon," she said, as she refilled coffee mugs. "Radio says we might be snowed in for 3, maybe 4 days. The bikers exchanged glances. "We don't want to be a burden," Preacher said. "Maybe when it slows down a bit we could try to make it to town." Dorothy fixed him with a stern look. "In this weather? On those motorcycles? That's just foolishness talking. Besides," she added more gently, "it's no burden. It's nice having the house full again." After breakfast, the restlessness set in. 9 large men accustomed to life on the road found themselves confined to a farmhouse with nothing to do. Dorothy watched as they paced, checked their phones, no signal, and peered out windows at the continuing snowfall. "This won't do," she said finally. "If we're going to be stuck together, might as well make ourselves useful." She began assigning tasks. Wood needed to be brought in from the covered pile by the back door. The generator needed checking in case the power went out, and there were always repairs to be done around an old farmhouse. To her surprise, the bikers accepted these assignments without complaint. Soon, Hammer and Bear were bringing in armloads of firewood. Preacher and Tink were examining the generator, and 2 others, Grizzly and Wolf, were fixing a loose cabinet door in the kitchen that had been wobbling for months. Dorothy supervised it all from her rocking chair, giving directions and occasionally getting up to demonstrate the right way to do something. By lunchtime, a dozen small repairs had been completed around the house, and Dorothy's to-do list, which had grown long since Thomas's passing, was considerably shorter. As Dorothy prepared sandwiches for lunch, Rookie sat at the kitchen table, his splendid arm resting carefully on a pillow. Despite the pain medication Dorothy had given him from her well-stocked first aid kit, he looked uncomfortable. "Distraction helps with pain," Dorothy told him, placing a sandwich in front of him. "Tell me about yourself. How'd you end up riding with the Angels?" Rookie looked surprised by her interest. "My uncle was a member," he said after a moment. "He raised me after my mom took off. When I turned 18, joining the club seemed natural." "And do you have a real name, or do I keep calling you Rookie?" Dorothy asked with a smile. The young man hesitated, then said, "It's Henry, but nobody's called me that in years." "Henry," Dorothy repeated. "That was my father's name." Something in her tone made the young man look up. There was no judgment in Dorothy's eyes, just genuine interest. And suddenly Henry found himself talking, really talking for the first time in a long while. He told her about growing up with his uncle, about his dream of opening a custom bike shop someday, about the brotherhood he'd found with the Hells Angels. Dorothy listened, really listened, in a way Henry couldn't remember anyone doing since his uncle passed away. When he finally fell silent, she simply patted his good hand and said, "You're more than just what that jacket says. Henry, don't you forget it." Throughout the day, similar conversations happened around the farmhouse. Dorothy moved among her guests, asking questions, listening to stories, sharing bits of her own life. The bikers, initially reserved, gradually opened up. Tink had been a mechanical engineer before losing his job in the 2008 recession. Grizzly had 3 kids he rarely got to see after a bitter divorce. Wolf was putting his younger sister through college with the money he made as a bouncer at a club in California. By evening, the atmosphere in the house had changed. The wariness had faded, replaced by a growing sense of camaraderie. Dorothy taught Preacher and Doc how to play gin rummy at the kitchen table, while Bear and Hammer helped her prepare dinner, a hearty chicken and dumplings that had been Thomas's favorite. "My husband would have liked you boys," Dorothy commented as they worked. "He never had much patience for pretense. Said you could tell a person's character by how they handled 3 things: hard work, hard times, and how they treated those who couldn't do anything for them." "Sounds like a wise man," Hammer said, carefully rolling out dough under Dorothy's instruction. "He was," Dorothy agreed. "Not perfect, mind you. Stubborn as the day is long, but good. We had 41 years together before his heart gave out." "That's rare these days," Bear commented. 41 years, Dorothy nodded. "Wasn't always easy. We had our share of struggles. Being one of the only black families in the county back then, well, it took time for people to see past that. But Thomas always said, 'Give 'em time to know you, and most folks come around.' Did they?" Hammer asked. "Come around?" Dorothy smiled. Most did. Some never will. That's just life. As night fell again, with the storm still raging outside, Dorothy brought out photo albums. The bikers gathered around as she showed them pictures of the farm through the years. Thomas building the barn, their children growing up, the changes to the land over decades. That's James, she said softly, pointing to a photo of a smiling man with Dorothy's eyes. My youngest. The one we lost to cancer. The room fell silent. Then Preacher spoke up. The brother we were heading to bury. He fought cancer too. Pancreatic. Gone in 6 months. Dorothy nodded, understanding in her eyes. It's a terrible thing watching someone you love slip away like that. James fought for 3 years. By the end, he was just so tired. Was he here when... Doc couldn't finish the question. Yes, Dorothy said. He came home for those last few months. Wanted to see the seasons change one more time, he said. Tears glimmered in her eyes, but her voice remained steady. We set up a bed right there by the window, so he could see the sunrise every morning. Without a word, Hammer reached out and covered her hand with his massive one. No platitudes, no awkward condolences, just the simple human connection of shared grief. Dorothy looked around the room at these 9 men, tattooed, rough, members of an organization with a fearsome reputation, and saw not the patches on their jackets but the humanity beneath. Men with pasts and futures, with loves and losses, with dreams and disappointments. More coffee? She asked, rising from her chair. And I think there's some apple pie left from yesterday. Later, as everyone prepared for another night in the snowbound farmhouse, Dorothy found Hammer standing by the window in the kitchen, staring out into the darkness. Penny for your thoughts, she said, coming to stand beside him. Hammer was quiet for a long moment. I was just thinking about how things work out sometimes. If you hadn't come looking for us in that storm, but I did, Dorothy said simply. No use dwelling on what didn't happen. Why did you? Hammer asked, turning to look at her. Come out in that blizzard? You didn't know who we were. Could have been anyone. Dorothy considered this. Didn't matter who you were. Anyone stuck out in that storm needed help. That's all there was to it. Hammer shook his head, a small smile on his weathered face. You're something else, Dorothy Jenkins. Just an old woman who's seen enough of life to know what matters, she replied. And what matters is how we treat each other when it counts. As Dorothy headed to her bedroom, she paused in the doorway and looked back at the big biker. Besides, she added with a twinkle in her eye, at my age, what's the worst that could happen? I've already had my 10. Everything after that is just bonus time. Hammer's laughter followed her down the hallway, a deep, genuine sound that seemed to warm the old house despite the howling wind outside. On the 3rd morning, Dorothy woke to silence. The constant howl of wind that had been the backdrop to the past 2 days was gone. She got out of bed and went to the window, pulling back the curtain to reveal a world transformed. Everything was white, pristine, the snow piled in smooth drifts that completely buried her garden fence. But the sky above was a clear, brilliant blue. The storm had finally passed. Dorothy dressed quickly and made her way to the kitchen. To her surprise, she found Hammer and Doc already there, coffee made, bacon frying in a pan. Morning, Dorothy, Doc said, offering her a steaming mug. Thought we'd get breakfast started. Hope that's okay. Dorothy accepted the coffee with a smile. More than okay. Smells wonderful. Hammer gestured toward the window. Storm's broken. Roads should be cleared in a day or so. There was something in his tone, a note of reluctance perhaps, that made Dorothy look at him more closely. You boys in a hurry to leave? Hammer shrugged, his massive shoulders rising and falling. Got responsibilities. The club expects us back, but he hesitated. Been thinking about your place here. Lot of work for one person. Dorothy sipped her coffee. I manage. No doubt, Doc interjected. But before we go, we'd like to help out a bit more. Pay you back for what you've done for us. By the time the other bikers had awakened, a plan had been formed. The Angels would stay one more day, using it to tackle some of the bigger maintenance issues around the farm that Dorothy had been putting off. Before returning to their chapter, they would make sure she was set for the remainder of winter. After breakfast, the group split into teams. Hammer, Bear, and Grizzly headed out to check the condition of the barn and outbuildings. Wolf and Tink climbed carefully onto the roof to repair some loose shingles that had been bothering Dorothy since the fall. Preacher and Doc took inventory of her pantry and generator fuel, making lists of what she might need to get through the winter. Henry, still nursing his broken arm, kept Dorothy company in the kitchen, helping as best he could while she prepared a stew for dinner. "You don't have to do all this," Dorothy told him as she chopped vegetables. Henry smiled, a genuine expression that made him look even younger. "We want to. Honestly, I don't remember the last time someone took care of me like you did." Most people see the jacket and cross to the other side of the street. Dorothy shook her head. "They're lost then." Out in the yard, the other angels were discovering that farm work was harder than it looked. Hammer, used to the precise mechanics of motorcycles, found himself baffled by the ancient tractor in Dorothy's barn. "This thing's older than I am," he muttered, examining the engine. Bear, who had grown up on a farm before finding his way to the club, laughed. "Move over, city boy. Let me show you how it's done." Under Bear's guidance, they got the tractor running, its engine coughing to life with a belch of smoke. With the driveway cleared, they could reach the main road when it was eventually plowed. On the roof, Wolf and Tink replaced missing shingles, their hands numb with cold despite gloves. "Worth it, though," Tink said, looking out over the snow-covered landscape. "View's something else up here." Wolf nodded, hammering another shingle into place. "Peaceful. I get why she stays, even alone." By midday, Dorothy's farm had transformed into a hive of activity. The bikers moved with purpose, their natural energy channeled into productive work. Dorothy supervised from the porch, wrapped in a heavy blanket, offering advice when needed, but mostly watching with growing emotion as these men, strangers just days ago, poured themselves into helping her. "Never seen the angels doing community service before," Preacher joked as he passed by with an armload of firewood. Dorothy chuckled. "Is that what this is?" Preacher paused, his expression growing serious. "No, ma'am. This is family taking care of family." The simple statement brought unexpected tears to Dorothy's eyes. She blinked them away quickly, but not before Preacher noticed. He set down his load and came to sit beside her on the porch step. "You know," he said quietly, "in the club we have a saying, blood makes you related, but loyalty makes you family." Dorothy nodded, understanding. "What you did," Preacher continued, "coming out in that blizzard for people you didn't know, that's the kind of loyalty that's rare in this world." Inside, Henry was setting the table for lunch when he noticed something on Dorothy's mantelpiece. A small, framed needlepoint with a verse embroidered in faded thread. "Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares." Henry stared at it for a long moment, then called out, "Dorothy, what's this verse mean? The one about angels?" Dorothy came in from the porch, brushing snow from her sweater. "That is from the Bible, Hebrews chapter 13. It means you never know who might cross your path, so treat everyone with kindness. My grandmother made that for me when Thomas and I got married." Henry's eyes moved from the needlepoint to the woman before him, then to the window where he could see his brothers working in the yard. "Kind of funny, isn't it? You taking in angels during a storm?" Dorothy followed his gaze and smiled. "I don't think that's the kind the verse was talking about, but yes, there's a certain irony there." After lunch, Hammer asked to use Dorothy's phone to check on road conditions. The county plow had made it to within 5 miles of her driveway and was expected to reach them by the following afternoon. The club members would be able to leave the day after next. The news was met with mixed feelings. There was relief, certainly. They had responsibilities to return to, brothers wondering what had happened to them, but also a reluctance that surprised the angels themselves. None of them were in a particular hurry to leave the warmth of Dorothy's farmhouse and her generous care. As the afternoon wore on, the work continued. Dorothy insisted on helping despite protests from the bikers. She showed Bear how to repair a broken fence post, taught Grizzly the proper way to stack firewood so it would stay dry, and supervised Wolf and Tink as they fixed a leaking gutter. By evening, exhaustion had set in, the good kind that comes from honest work. They gathered around Dorothy's table for the hearty stew she'd prepared, hungrily devouring second and third helpings. "Never knew farm work was such a workout," Tink commented, flexing sore muscles. "Tried doing it every day for 50 years, Dorothy replied with a smile. After dinner, as they sat around the fire, a comfortable silence fell over the group. It was Hammer who finally broke it, clearing his throat with uncharacteristic hesitation. "Dorothy," he began, "we've been talking. The boys and I." Dorothy looked up from her knitting. Oh, when we leave here. Well, we don't like the idea of you being out here all alone, especially in winter. Dorothy set down her needles. I've been managing on my own for 10 years now since Thomas passed. No doubt, Hammer agreed. But things happen. Power goes out. You get sick. Car breaks down miles from anywhere. He paused. We'd like to stay in touch. Check in on you. Maybe come back in the spring and help with some bigger projects around the place. Dorothy looked around the room at 9 faces, all watching her with earnest expressions. These men, with their tattoos and leather and fierce reputations, were offering her something she hadn't realized how much she'd missed. Connection. Community. The knowledge that someone was looking out for her. That's very kind, she said carefully. But your club isn't exactly local, and I wouldn't want to be a burden. Our chapters and Billings, Doc explained. That's only about 3 hours from here. We make runs through this area several times a year. It wouldn't be out of our way. And we've got brothers in chapters all over the country, Bear added, including some not far from here. We take care of our own, Dorothy, and as far as we're concerned, you're one of ours now. Dorothy felt a lump form in her throat. She hadn't realized until this moment how lonely she'd been since James died, how much she'd missed having people to care for and who cared for her in return. I'd like that, she said finally, her voice slightly unsteady. Very much, Hammer nodded, satisfied. Then it settled. We'll give you our numbers before we leave. Any problems, day or night, you call. One of us will be here. And we're coming back in the spring, Henry added firmly. I want to see this place when it's not buried in snow. Dorothy smiled, blinking back unexpected tears. The garden's lovely in May, and I make a mean rhubarb pie. Later that night, after the others had gone to sleep, Dorothy sat alone in the kitchen, a cup of tea cooling before her. The events of the past few days felt almost dreamlike. The rescue in the blizzard, the strangers becoming friends, the promise of continued connection. She hadn't expected any of it when she'd spotted those headlights in the storm. A soft sound made her look up. Hammer stood in the doorway, his massive frame silhouetted against the dim light from the living room. Couldn't sleep? She asked. He shook his head, coming to join her at the table. Too much on my mind. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, then Hammer spoke. I want you to know something, Dorothy. What you did for us, it means more than you know. Dorothy waved a dismissive hand. Anyone would have. No, Hammer interrupted gently. They wouldn't have. Most people see guys like us, they lock their doors. They call the police. They don't walk out into blizzards. To save us. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something small and metallic, a pin in the shape of the Hells Angels' Death's head insignia. In EO? The club, he explained, placing it on the table between them. We have a tradition. When someone outside the club does something extraordinary for a member, something that maybe saves their life or changes it, they become what we call a friend of the club. He pushed the pin toward her. It means you have our respect, our protection. Wherever you go, if you ever meet another angel, you show them this and they'll treat you like family. Dorothy stared at the small pin, understanding the significance of what was being offered. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Hammer replied. Just know that as long as any of us are breathing, you've got people looking out for you. That's how we repay our debts in the club. Dorothy reached out and picked up the pin, turning it over in her fingers. Then she looked up at Hammer, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Thank you, she said simply. Hammer nodded, a rare smile softening his weathered face. Thank you, Dorothy Jenkins, for reminding 9 old road dogs that there's still good in this world. As Dorothy finally went to bed that night, pin clutched carefully in her hand. She felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time, a sense of belonging, of connection that stretched beyond the boundaries of her isolated farm. Tomorrow she would sew the pin onto her favorite jacket, and when spring came, she would plant extra vegetables in her garden, knowing there would be more hungry mouths to feed. The blizzard that had threatened their lives had, in its strange way, given her a new family, and for the first time since burying her son, Dorothy Jenkins fell asleep without feeling alone. Spring came to Montana slowly, the snow retreating inch by inch, revealing the dormant earth beneath. For Dorothy Jenkins, the winter had passed differently than any in recent memory. True to their word, the Hells Angels had stayed in touch. Every Sunday evening, like clockwork, her phone would ring. Sometimes it was Hammer. his deep voice asking about the weather, if she needed anything, how she was feeling. Other times it was Doc or Preacher or Bear. Occasionally it was Henry, his young voice eager as he told her about his progress in physical therapy for his arm. They sent packages too, boxes of groceries, books, warm socks, and once, a satellite phone for emergencies that worked even when the landlines went down during a February ice storm. When Dorothy's old truck wouldn't start in January, a biker from a nearby chapter appeared the next day with parts to fix it. Dorothy had told her daughter Lillian about her new friends, but Lillian had been skeptical. "Hell's Angels, Mama. Are you sure that's safe?" "Safer than freezing to death in a blizzard," Dorothy had replied firmly. "Don't judge what you don't understand, Lillian. Your father taught you better than that." As April turned to May, Dorothy's garden began to come alive. She spent hours on her knees in the rich soil, planting the vegetables that would sustain her through the next winter, and making sure to plant extra, just as she'd promised herself. It was on a warm Saturday in late May, the kind of day when the Montana sky seems impossibly huge and blue, that Dorothy heard the distant rumble of motorcycles. She was in the garden, a wide-brimmed hat shading her face from the sun when the sound reached her. Straightening up, one hand pressed against her lower back, she shaded her eyes and looked toward the road. A line of motorcycles appeared, sunlight glinting off chrome, the riders clad in leather despite the warmth of the day. Dorothy felt her heart lift at the sight. She hadn't been sure they would really come back. The bikes turned into her driveway, engines growling as they approached the farmhouse. Dorothy counted, 9, 10, 11, 12. There were more than before. As they parked in a neat row beside her barn, she recognized Hammer at the lead, his massive frame unmistakable even at a distance. Dorothy removed her gardening gloves and walked toward them, unable to keep the smile from her face. Hammer dismounted first, removing his helmet and striding toward her with his arms open. "Dorothy Jenkins," he called, his voice carrying across the yard. "Garden's looking good." Dorothy found herself enveloped in a bear hug that lifted her feet off the ground. She laughed, patting Hammer's back. "Put me down, you big fool. I'm too old for such nonsense." Hammer set her down gently, his weathered face split by a wide grin. "You don't look a day over 60. "Flatterer," Dorothy chided, but she was smiling too. The other riders had dismounted and were approaching now. Dorothy recognized Doc, Preacher, Bear, Tink, Wolf, and Grizzly. Henry came last, moving a bit stiffly but with both arms working properly now. "The arm healed well?" Dorothy asked as he reached her. Henry nodded, flexing his right arm. "Good as new, thanks to you. Doctor said if you hadn't said it so well right away, might have been permanent damage." There were 5 new faces too, angels from other chapters, Hammer explained, who had heard the story of what Dorothy had done and wanted to meet her for themselves. "Word gets around in the club," he said with a shrug. "You're something of a legend now." Dorothy snorted. "Nonsense. Now all of you must be hungry after that ride. I've got lemonade and sandwiches ready in the kitchen." The bikers followed her into the house, removing their cuts, as they called their leather vests, and hanging them neatly by the door. Dorothy noticed that they wiped their boots carefully on the mat without being asked, a small courtesy that touched her. In the kitchen, they crowded around her table, passing plates and glasses, filling the house with their laughter and stories. Dorothy watched them, these men who had become such an unexpected part of her life, and felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the spring sunshine. After lunch, Hammer cleared his throat. "We didn't just come to visit, Dorothy. We came to work." He explained that over the winter the club had taken up a collection. Members from chapters across the country had contributed, even ones who had never met Dorothy but had heard her story. They had brought materials to repair her barn roof, paint the house, fix the sagging front porch, and replace the aging fence around her property. "We've got 2 weeks, Hammer said. "By the time we leave, this place will be better than new." Dorothy started to protest, to say it was too much, but looking at their faces, earnest, determined, kind beneath the tough exteriors, she knew it would be pointless. And more than that, she recognized the need behind the offer. These men wanted to do this, needed to do this, not just for her, but for themselves. "Well," she said finally, "I suppose I could use the help, but you'll all stay here, of course. I won't have you paying for motels when I've got perfectly good rooms." And so began what the neighbors would later refer to as the summer. Dorothy Jenkins had a biker gang for house guests. For 2 weeks, the angels worked from sunup to sundown, transforming Dorothy's farm. They replaced rotten boards, mended fences, painted walls, and fixed the decades-old wiring that had been giving her trouble. The angels took turns cooking dinner, revealing unexpected talents. Preacher made a gumbo that brought tears to Dorothy's eyes with its spiciness. Bare-baked bread that rivaled her own. Even Henry, with his newly healed arm, proved adept at grilling steaks to perfection. In the evenings, they gathered on Dorothy's newly rebuilt porch, drinking beer and telling stories as the sun set over the mountains. Dorothy would sit in her rocking chair, a light blanket over her knees despite the mild weather, listening to these men talk about their lives, their hopes, their losses. Word spread quickly in the small community. Neighbors drove by slowly, curious about the line of motorcycles parked by Dorothy's barn. Some stopped, cautious at first, then increasingly friendly as they saw the work being done. A few even brought over casseroles or pies, traditional country welcomes that were received with genuine appreciation by the angels. Pastor Williams from Dorothy's church came by on the fourth day, his initial wariness giving way to admiration as Hammer respectfully showed him the repairs they'd made to Dorothy's roof. "It's a blessing, what you're doing for her," the pastor said. "Dorothy's been a pillar of our community for 50 years. Hammer nodded. "She saved our lives, Pastor. This doesn't begin to repay that." By the end of the first week, something remarkable was happening. The barriers that might normally exist between a group of aging bikers and a rural Montana community began to dissolve. The local hardware store owner, who had initially watched the angels with suspicion when they came in for supplies, was now saving materials he thought they might need. The waitress at the diner in town knew their orders by heart and slipped extra pie onto their plates. And Dorothy, who had lived a somewhat isolated existence since Thomas's death, found herself at the center of a growing community. Neighbors who hadn't visited in years stopped by, ostensibly to meet the bikers but staying to reconnect with her. Her phone rang more often, not just with calls from the angels but from local friends checking in. One evening, as Dorothy sat on the porch with Hammer, watching the others play an impromptu game of horseshoes in the yard, she said quietly, "You know what you've really fixed here? It wasn't just the barn or the fence or the porch." Hammer looked at her questioningly. "You've mended the connections," Dorothy explained. "Between me and this place, between me and my neighbors. Somehow you rough boys have reminded everyone what community really means." Hammer was silent for a moment, then said, "That's what you did for us too, Dorothy, in that blizzard. You reminded us that we're not just angels. We're people first, connected to other people." The second week passed too quickly. On the final evening, Dorothy insisted on cooking a feast. Fried chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans from her garden, and 3 different pies for dessert. The angels ate like it was their last meal, complimenting her cooking with genuine enthusiasm. After dinner, as they gathered in the living room, Hammer motioned for silence. He stood somewhat awkwardly holding a small package. "Dorothy," he began, "we've got something for you." From all of us, he handed her the package. Dorothy unwrapped it carefully to find a leather vest, a smaller version of the ones the angels wore, but with some notable differences. Instead of the traditional death's head patches, this one bore a custom embroidered patch on the back, a farmhouse with mountains in the background, surrounded by the words "Mother of the Road" and "Protected." "It's not official club gear," Hammer explained. "You can't wear our patches, that's against club rules. But this is just for you. It means wherever you go, whatever happens, you've got family looking out for you." Dorothy ran her fingers over the fine stitching, the supple leather, understanding the significance of the gift. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "There's more," Henry said, coming forward. He held out a small envelope. "From all the chapters. We took up a collection." Inside the envelope, Dorothy found a bank card and a note explaining that a special account had been set up in her name. Every month, a deposit would be made, enough to cover any maintenance the farm might need, any help she might want to hire, any expenses that might arise as she grew older. "We can't be here all the time," Doc explained, "but we can make sure you're taken care of. Always." Dorothy looked around at the circle of faces, these men who had come into her life by chance, through a blizzard and an act of simple human kindness, and who had become something she never expected. Family. "I don't know what to say," she admitted, her voice thick with emotion. "You don't need to say anything," Hammer told her. "Just know that as long as any of us are on the road, you're never alone." The next morning dawned clear and bright. The angels packed their saddlebags, loaded their bikes, and prepared to leave. But this departure was different from the last. This time there were promises to return soon, concrete plans for the next visit. This time there were phone numbers exchanged and dates marked on calendars. As the bikers mounted their motorcycles, Dorothy stood on her porch, the new vest draped over her shoulders despite the warmth of the day. One by one, the angels came to her for a hug, a word of thanks, a moment of connection. Henry was the last. "I'm coming back in July," he promised. "Got 2 weeks vacation. Thought maybe you could teach me more about gardening." Dorothy patted his cheek. "I'll save you some weeding." Finally, they were all mounted, engines rumbling in the quiet morning air. Hammer gave a signal, and as one, the angels raised their fists in salute to the small woman standing on the porch of the farmhouse. Dorothy raised her own fist in return, a gesture that would have seemed foreign to her just months ago but now felt right. As the motorcycles roared down her driveway, she didn't feel the sadness of goodbye but the anticipation of return. Inside the house, the phone was already ringing, Lillian calling to see how the visit had gone. On the kitchen table lay a schedule the angels had created, ensuring that someone would check on Dorothy every week. In the refrigerator, meals had been prepared and frozen for days when cooking might be too much effort. And in Dorothy's heart was a certainty that had been missing since Thomas died, since James succumbed to cancer, the knowledge that she was not alone. That family could be found in the most unexpected places, that a simple act of kindness in a blizzard could create bonds stronger than blood. As the sound of motorcycles faded into the distance, Dorothy Jenkins looked out over her farm, repaired, renewed, ready for whatever seasons might come, and smiled. The storm that had threatened to take lives had instead created a different kind of angels, unaware. And in the years that followed, the sight of Hell's Angels stopping by a certain farmhouse in Montana became so common that locals no longer stared. The legend of the black grandmother who rescued 9 bikers in a blizzard grew, spreading through chapters across the country, a reminder to all who heard it that family isn't always who you're born to. Sometimes, it's who picks you up when you fall, who walks out into a storm to bring you home, who sees past patches and colors to the humanity beneath. For Dorothy Jenkins and her angels, that knowledge was enough. More than enough. It was everything.